She had practiced influence like a craft. It had become part of the architecture of her life. The ledger was full. The network was in place. She could access favors, silence, and minor concessions when she needed them. But influence is not power until it is tested by loss. The test came as quietly as everything else in her life. A phone call that rearranged a plan, an accidental disclosure, a momentary misstep that tugged at the threads she had woven. Claire's acceptance of the job in the other city arrived sooner than the woman expected. There were goodbyes that felt rehearsed and promises that weighed like lead. The woman found herself alone in her apartment with the mirror and the crack and the ledger. She thought of the colleague who had once written hurt into an email and wondered if he had been a warning sign rather than a mistake. She thought of the child she had been who learned to trade and barter for warmth. Grief settled into her in a way that felt like debt collection. Her first instinct was to call, to use the small acts of attention that had always steered other people back into her orbit. She sat with the phone as if it were an instrument she needed to tune. She did not call. Instead, she wrote a letter, a careful, slow composition that read like an apology and a gift. She sent it anonymously through mutual friends so that Claire would feel the pull of something untraceable and benevolent. It was a test of whether her emotional control could survive without direct contact. The letter landed like a stone in still water. Claire replied with confusion and appreciation, probing for the sender. The ambiguity pleased the woman. It made the influence feel durable and not dependent on proximity. But influence that depends on ambiguity is like a ghost. It cannot be inspected without becoming less eerie and more ordinary. Then came the misstep. An old friend, someone who had been part of her ledger in a minor way, mentioned a small, offhand truth about her childhood in a conversation that was supposed to be private. The recollection leaked into a group chat. A rumor took its shape. People began to piece together details in a way that made her feel exposed. The world had always misunderstood her to be younger and simpler. Now, for the first time in years, the ledger began to show withdrawals she had not authorized. She felt panic then, not the loud panic of panic attacks she had read about, but a cold, precise panic that made her count the costs and calculate the next move. She tried to smooth the rumor with plausible explanations, with practiced humility. She offered reassurances that felt honest and false in the same breath. A few people accepted them. Others hesitated. The balance she had so carefully maintained wavered. People react to perceived betrayal in ways that map to their own fears. Her colleague unfriended her on social platforms without explanation. Claire texted less. The small acts of kindness she had cultivated suddenly required negotiation. She began to understand that influence is reciprocal. To hold it, someone must believe in the story you create. Once that belief cracks, the structure becomes vulnerable. In those days, she slept poorly. When she woke, the mirror with its hairline crack seemed to have multiplied into many small fractures across the world. She woke with a strange clarity. The ledger had not been emptying itself into advantage. It had been building a kind of isolation. People who had once drawn close had done so for reasons that included her usefulness. Their departure was not a moral indictment. It was the natural consequence of what she had offered and withheld. She could have returned to the raw methods of her youth, to begging or pleading or offering herself in ways she had long avoided. Instead, she tried something else: honesty. It was a dangerous strategy because honesty, when it replaces carefully placed illusions, can either ruin or redeem. She spoke with 3 people who mattered most and admitted the things she had never said aloud: that she had used gentleness as a device, that her youthful face had been armor and instrument. She watched their faces as if watching film, learning which frames would hold. Responses were mixed. Some recoiled with the kind of hurt that feels like a small moral earthquake. Others, weirdly, accepted it with a quiet that felt like permission to be flawed. Claire replied to one of her messages with a line that was neither forgiveness nor accusation. Just fact. People do what they can with what they're given. It read like an appraisal. And in that appraisal she found something like a verdict and something like relief. The real test was not their reactions, but her own. Admitting the truth did not undo the ledger. It did not rebuild the friendship she had optimized, but it changed the way she saw herself in relation to other people. Confession was not catharsis. It was an alteration of method. Where she once arranged perceptions to live safer, she now found herself wanting to arrange fewer things and to accept more unpredictability. That desire terrified her as much as it exhilarated her. In the weeks that followed, she practiced small acts of unapologetic clarity. She refused a favor she would once have granted with a charming smile. She answered questions directly. The world did not collapse. It shifted. There were losses, for sure. The ledger showed negative balances in places she had considered secure. But there was also a new arithmetic. Measures of authenticity that did not demand repayment. One night she stood before the mirror and traced the hairline crack with an index finger, as if following a river back to its source. The face that looked younger than her age was still there, and the tools of dark psychology she had wielded with such care remained within reach. She could return to the old ways and smooth the hurt and regain what she had lost. Or she could let the ledger lie open and learn to live with the consequences of being more visible than she had planned. She did not make a dramatic choice. Life, she had learned, rarely offered those. She folded the ledger away into a drawer she rarely opened. She called Claire and spoke about small things first, then about what mattered. The conversation was stilted and honest, and when it ended they agreed to meet at some point in the future. It was not reconciliation so much as a tentative truce. The balance had shifted. She felt less like a conductor and more like a person in a room with other people who could not always be arranged. That was frightening and oddly freeing. She understood at last that youth as camouflage could not be a substitute for being seen. The dark psychology she had perfected had preserved her in a way, but it had also cost her the very kind of vulnerability that might lead to something like belonging. If this story made you think, subscribe for more dark truths, because every mind hides what it fears most. She learned to hide in the small niceties of daily routine. The way she folded a napkin, the exact tilt of her head when listening, the rehearsed softness of her laugh, each was calibrated to lower defenses. After the colleague's message, she began to test the limits of what could be redirected without detection. She did not feel proud. She felt methodological, like someone examining a familiar illness to understand its spread. Her childhood had been a map of scarcity. There were rooms where affection arrived late and apologies sounded like currency. Old lessons had taught her to trade appearances for safety, a smile for warmth, a humor for acceptance. Those trades had carved grooves in her behavior that she now slid into easily. The dark psychology she practiced was its descendant, a refined version of those primitive bargains. She wondered, sometimes, if the person who had learned this in order to survive would be startled by the person who wielded it now. She found a new target in a woman named Claire, who worked in the same building. Claire was steady, with a steadiness that looked like armor. She had a history written in the soft lines around her eyes and an impatience for pretense. Where others offered admiration, Claire offered labor, a competence that made people trust her. She was not the type to read a reflection and bend its light. That was exactly why the woman chose her. The first move was small and almost invisible. She invited Claire for coffee in the false casualness of two people in a hallway. She watched Claire's shoulders loosen, the slight curiosity that reached the eyes. She told a fragment of a story, a childhood anecdote that sounded disarming. It contained a tiny, untrue detail, designed not to be checked. People rarely fact-checked petty intimacies. They wanted them to be true. Claire smiled and admitted an ache she'd disguised for years. That admission was a fissure. There were no overt manipulations, only a steady placement of truths and fabrications, until Claire's defenses rearranged to fit the new narrative. The woman listened with the full, undemanding attention that had opened doors before. She offered small acts of help that felt natural and earned. Slowly, she acquired access to Claire's time and confidences. She cataloged the moments Claire hesitated to say, the secrets she left half told. Each omission was an opening. Her methods were not cruel, but intentional. She learned to name emotions in ways that made them feel safer to disclose. The human mind tends to meet a named fear. When Claire confessed a worry about failing, the woman reframed it as something common, even forgivable. She planted suggestions like seeds in soft earth. Claire began to rely on her small reframings. The woman observed, with a sterile tenderness, how influence accumulated like dust on a shelf. Yet patterns left traces for her too. When Claire trusted her, she expected reciprocation. The woman found herself needing to respond with a transparency that matched the trust. That demand was unfamiliar and disconcerting. She had become so practiced at arranging other people's proportions that an intimate reliance felt like a mirror held too close. She could see the ledger grow, and with it, an odd tenderness for the person whose life fit neatly into her design. There was also the complication of desire. Influence produces proximity, and proximity can create attachments that are not merely strategic. She noticed the quiet warmth of Claire's voice when they spoke late into the night about mundane things. She felt a protective impulse that contradicted her ledger's calculations. It was small, dangerous, and real. The rules she had followed with almost scientific detachment began to blur. She tried to measure the feeling and name it with the vocabulary she knew: control, stewardship, guardianship. None of those words fit. This feeling was messy. It tugged at something under the practiced stiffs of her life, a memory of being watched over and, in turn, offering protection without asking for price. The woman did not know whether this softness would become leverage or ruin her method. She did know that when she allowed herself to be present in it, the mirror's crack seemed to widen in an unsteady way. At the same time, another pattern emerged that made her uneasy. People she influenced began to mirror her in small, suspicious ways. Claire adjusted to the rhythms the woman set. The colleague who had written a hurt message softened in emails, echoing her phrases. They became, without knowing it, versions of the world she wanted. That realization should have felt triumphant. Instead, it gave her vertigo. She had created a network of dependencies, subtle and invisible, and wondered what would happen if one of those threads snapped. She experimented with breaking a thread. She withheld a tiny kindness and watched the resulting imbalance. The person who had come to rely on it noticed and shifted, sometimes in ways that revealed resentment, sometimes in ways that exposed an unexpected vulnerability. The woman cataloged each reaction. Each one showed how delicate the architecture of emotional control really was. It could not be maintained without constant, attentive labor. Fear in her world was never sudden. It was the slow recognition that the ledger required constant maintenance, and that maintenance demanded a presence she could not always guarantee. The thought of losing the ability to direct perceptions, of being seen exactly as she was, without the veil of youth or charm, was terrifying. That terror was not about reputation. It was about being vulnerable in a way that had once led to being small and used. One evening, Claire confided something that did not fit any script. She had been offered a job in another city. The news arrived like a test. The woman felt something like grief and something like rage turn in the same space. She had to decide whether to keep Claire with more deliberate manipulation or to let her go and risk the architecture collapsing elsewhere. The choice would define her, to cling or to release. She chose, in that moment, to say nothing overt. Instead, she sent a small message of support that contained the right mix of warmth and encouragement. She watched Claire reply with gratitude and a vague promise to stay close. That reply settled like ash in the woman's stomach. She had not won Claire, but she had kept the connection loose enough to feel secure. It was not the same as love. It was a protective maneuver disguised as generosity. In the quiet after the message, she realized the pattern had shifted. The woman who once moved like a shadow now saw the web she'd constructed, and the web looked fragile. She had traded old hurts for a system of influence that required constant tending. The ledger, once a comfort, felt like a ledger of debts owed to herself. She wondered for the first time whether the dark psychology that had preserved her might also be the thing that would finally make her small. She had always looked younger than she was. The world noticed first, easier smiles, less worry in the eyes, the kind of smoothness that people misread as innocence. It was a small, dark truth she wore like perfume, youth as camouflage. The dark psychology of that face was not a miracle. It was an armored dot. She moved through rooms like sunlight through blinds, quiet and precise. People leaned forward when she entered, wanting less to know her and more to keep her image. Men complimented her skin. Women envied her lightness. Strangers assumed a story they could finish without asking. All of it was a currency she measured without counting. She knew how their gaze fell, which corners of a conversation they would fill with praise, where they'd hesitate and offer themselves as confidants. It had taken years to learn that people did not simply see her. They projected on her. That projection was hers to tilt. She lived on the second floor of an old building that smelled of lemon oil and rain. The apartment was minimal. A narrow couch, a single framed photograph that read like a chapter she no longer wanted to open. A tall mirror with a hairline crack that bisected her reflection. In the evenings, she would stand before that mirror and watch how light pooled on her cheekbones. She cataloged every small victory. The softness under her eyes, the shallow line that never deepened, like evidence of some unspoken power. The evidence, to her, mattered less than what it could unlock. People assumed youthful appearance and youth of spirit were the same. They were not. She had memorized the human tendency to equate surface with goodness. There was a belief, almost superstitious, that youth equals simplicity, that smooth skin meant a straightforward life. She learned to let that assumption do the work she wanted done for her. In meetings, she smiled in the exact places that invited underestimation. In clubs, she laughed with a tilt that suggested naivete. She found, again and again, that the world handed her the small controls, a seat in a room, an invitation to a party, a strained apology from someone who'd overstepped. She accepted these tokens and set them aside like seeds. The first man who mattered noticed her because she didn't need him to. He was older, careful in his speech, with hands that suggested he had once been an artist and later learned to be precise for business. He called her by a different name at first, one that sounded like a history she did not mind being given. He asked about things she didn't want to tell and did not ask at all about the things she chose to keep. He was easy to read and harder to refuse. She let herself be seen in fractions. She observed everything he offered with the same clinical tenderness she used on her own face in the mirror. The dark psychology of interaction became her study. She watched how he tightened when she mentioned her job, how his smile softened when she said she lived alone, how he reached for metaphors that hinted at mentorship. She learned to place small, suggestive truths and watch how they expanded in someone else's mind. A word here, a pause there, and suddenly she stood where he had imagined. His generosity was a mirror too. It reflected the version of her he wanted, and she let it. Inside her there was a ledger, not of money but of leverage. Each moment of being underestimated became a credit she could withdraw. When the neighbor with a loud laugh accused her of being cold, she folded the comment into the ledger and later used a smile to soften an accusation. When a friend asked for favors she did not feel like granting, she let the friend think she didn't understand the request's urgency. People's inner stories were malleable, and that malleability was her quiet delight. There was no cruelty in it, she told herself. There was no conscious intent to harm. It was a survival method adapted into an elegant scale of influence. She had been small once in ways that hurt. The world had taught her to shrink, to speak less, to accept crumbs of recognition. Now she collected control instead, subtle and efficient. The small manipulations were more sustainable than direct force. They didn't break things. They redirected them. They allowed her to live as if in a private light, warm and guarded. Still, every act of tilting perception carried a weight. She felt it as a tiny fatigue behind her ribs, like muscle soreness after repetition. It was almost imperceptible until she sat alone in the dark and listened to the quiet that had nothing to offer her. In those moments, the mirror revealed a woman who had learned to perform innocence so well she sometimes woke with the taste of it in her mouth. The performance left traces, a hollowness in the throat, a reluctance to answer questions that wanted the truth. The first fracture came in a mundane way. A colleague, someone she had been fond of using, not cruelly, but deliberately, left a message that read as if hurt had finally found a voice. He wrote about feeling unseen, except when he served her needs. His words were not angry. They were small and exact, like a scalpel. For days the message hummed under her skin. People thought youth made her immune. It did not. The ledger did not forgive itself. It only recorded. She sat with the message and traced the edges of her choices. The dark psychology she practiced was not always clean. It gathered dust and left stains. She told herself she would be kinder. She would adjust. But kindness was another tool, and she knew how it could be used. So she decided instead to study the man's reaction and the anatomy of his complaint. She cataloged where she had pushed, where she had withheld, and where she had smiled to keep her advantages. Each note was clinical and without judgment, a scientist taking measurements. At night, she would press her palm to the mirror and imagine the crack was a river dividing two selves. On one side, the younger face the world adored. On the other, the tired woman who had taught herself to steer people gently into lanes that served her. The two selves were intimate conspirators. They traded identities by the hour. She would sleep with a small, near-hysterical gratitude that the world allowed such alchemy. People called it an advantage. She had learned to think of it instead as a responsibility to be precise, to be economical, to never waste the power she'd been given. She measured alliances, debts, and favors like a careful accountant. The words dark psychology, manipulation, and emotional control were not theoretical for her. They were the tools of daily life. She used them like a person uses a map in unfamiliar terrain. Each turn she took was deliberate. When she moved through the city in the mornings, the faces around her were landscapes she could read. Children with sticky hands, an old woman carrying bread, a teenager with headphones. Each offered a note of humanity she could tune to her purpose. She felt larger when she could predict the reaction. In that predictability, she found safety. But safety, she had learned, was fragile. The ledger could be balanced only if she remained unseen in her motives. The moment someone understood the trade, the balance shifted. And so she kept practicing the most dangerous art she knew, making people comfortable enough to reveal themselves while remaining a mystery. The world handed her the scripts. She only rearranged the lines. The face that looked younger than her age was not a gift. It was an instrument. It allowed her to map the human heart and to touch the strings others did not see. The dark psychology of her life was not loud. It was surgical.